how do I see the situation? I believe the situation is very, very bleak, because whatever you look on, all doors through which one could expect to get out from the present crisis are, in my view, closed. I don't see that the war will stop soon, or that even more a sustainable solution could be found. Between Abiy and TPLF, the rift is so deep that I don't know how they could compromise. If they compromise about a cessation of hostility or a ceasefire, okay, which is of course highly commendable, this will be only tactical or opportunistic. Why? Because their view cannot be negotiated and so as to reach a compromise. Now the international crisis, the international community has, in my view, an erroneous view of the crisis. It completely lacks the historical perspective to understand what is happening now. For the international community, usually the conflict between Abiy and the TPLF is the root of the crisis. It's not the root of the crisis, it's only the tip of the iceberg, okay? The root of the crisis is the, I would say, the heritage. For me, the root of the crisis is simply what I have called the decolonization of the former Ethiopian Empire. And that is not understood by the international community. So that means that they push for a solution which cannot be a lasting and long-time solution. And first, I am very bleak because that's probably for me the most important. I don't see any internal dynamic which would open one of these doors and at least show the way through by which a solution, a sustainable solution could be found. The opposition is totally absent, okay? You have now two main actors in this conflict, Abiy and its armed forces, and the armed opposition movements, TPLF mainly and Ola mainly. But I would say the non-armed opposition is totally inexistent. And that's for me the main problem today to progress toward a solution.
I agree with René in many ways, in the sense that Ethiopia's problem is not the day-to-day issue. That may be capturing the international attention. It may also present to Ethiopian political leaders something to really kind of go around and talk about it. But I think Ethiopia's number one problem is state formation. What the world sees and how it sees Ethiopia and what the people who live in Ethiopia see is totally different. Ethiopia's exceptionalism has been sold to the rest of the world. That Ethiopia is this nation state that has defeated European colonial powers, that stands the good image that Africa is supposed to have, and all that kind of narrative, which makes zero sense to many of the Ethiopians. As a matter of fact, Ethiopia holds to Ethiopians the contradictions that many societies that like America would have. Ethiopia is on the one hand a big nation or a state that has a lot of different people that serves as Africa's image for outsiders. It's also an African state that enslaved Africanists. Those of us who speak Amharic, we know the word Baria, Shankilla, meaning Negroid, Darky, Baria meaning slave. And some of us even lived recently when those institutions were thriving in Ethiopia. So as Rene indicated, Ethiopians want to undo that, but the world is married to the previous Ethiopian exceptionalists. That's the conundrum. So whether you sit at a negotiating table at the UN or a US-sponsored and EU-sponsored negotiation to resolve the conflict that we face today, whether it's in Tigray, in Oromia, or even before this in the Somali region, these two images are on the table. And I and people like us would like to talk about the image that is not the beautiful Ethiopia, and the world would like to protect this thing that has been given to us. And there comes really the joining of the hip between the oppressive governments that usually is at Aret Kilo and the international. That's where they join. The two of them just by this translation. So the Tigray conflict that we see, the Oromia war, the hitherto Somali conflict, which probably experienced it under EPRDF, a less intensive blockade that Tigray is now experiencing about 2 years. There is an endemic issue that we really need to do and redo about Ethiopia. I think what the road that we have been traveling at this point is to really maintain what the world and the UN and the West would like to maintain, which is the Ethiopian state. And find the debate would be, how should we maintain the Ethiopian state? Even if we take the hit, as those of us who have lived there, if we accept some shortcomings within the state, but what is a bit different state that we can have? And the current struggle in Ethiopia, when we will talk about that later in the discussion, is really beyond the Tigray conflict. I think the Tigray is the sacrificial lamb, if you will. So one way or another, either what Rene talked about would be on the table and how we talk about Ethiopian state formation, or the war would continue until one person or one side is eliminated. Thank you.
I just want to build on what Rene and Faisal said. Biggest issue is that Ethiopia this time is there is a civil war in the entire world, and people of goodwill in Ethiopia are trying to stop the civil war without really understanding and getting to the roots of the civil war. And I think it's important to define it for what it is. Sometimes this war is defined as a war between Abiy and Debrecen. Sometimes it's defined as a war between the federal government and the regional state of Tigray. Sometimes it is presented as an ideological war between federalists and unitarists. All of this at different levels may be true. But the problem right now, the war that started as an ideological difference or a war of ideological difference, a civil war, has escalated to a point where it's right now that Ethiopia is a state on the brink of a violent dissolution. And I want to underscore that. There could be disintegration with an agreement. There could be a velvet dissolution that could happen, but the Ethiopian one is a violent dissolution or disintegration. This is different from other controlled ways of dissolving a state that has become outlived its usefulness. So, but in the case of Ethiopia, it's going to be a violent dissolution. And the roots of the problem, to just put it in the different way, in a different way than what Rene and Faisal said, I think it's a civil war that resulted from 3 monumental failures of state building. The empire that Rene talked about, the empire that was put together by force, death, and mayhem, had been trying to become a state for its citizens. They tried different things. First is assimilation, create a more cohesive and stable state through assimilation, through the deracination of ethnic identity, and create a nation, an Ethiopian nation state. That failed, as we know, some 50 years ago. And there was another attempt that was the accommodation of the interest of the nations and nationalities in Ethiopia through a multinational federation, through a constitution for a nation of nations. That's what Fasil Nahum said, a constitution for the nation of nations. If Ethiopia is a nation, it's a nation of nations. Was rejected, what was proposed, and that through the constitution and the federal system, the issue of inclusiveness, including this, rather than eradicating or eliminating the states, was proposed through accommodation. The multinational federation and the constitution of nations, the constitution of a nation of nations was rejected violently beginning in 2018. And the third was the democratization. Through democratization, we thought that we could probably go from a federal arrangement that was in place but did not work through democratization, and that also failed. So the various nations and multinational nations went back 50 years back to the period of the unitary state and wanted to establish a unitary state. And that's the failure of assimilation, accommodation, and democratization is basically at the roots of the conflicts. Unless you go into those issues and address them one by one, I think Ethiopia right now is on the verge of violent dissolution.
I think a lot has been said. I don't have anything to add, but I think the first problem is that the distorted perception of Ethiopia and the unity of Ethiopia. That's been one of the issues for many years, because certain groups in Ethiopia think that like they want to create Ethiopia in their image, the way they want it, not the way it should be. So that's the main problem. So Abiy's coming to power is just a cause. He's a Trojan horse of these unitary oppressive groups. So I think that one of the problems is the distorted perception of Ethiopia. We're not even agreeing what Ethiopia should be. I think that's the main problem we're dealing with. Obviously, the war will continue for some time. The economic and the collapse of the nation it's now a reality. Ethiopia, as we all know, is the powerhouse of the African political life, the home of the African Union and many international organizations, including UN for Africa. So political turmoil or a crisis in Ethiopia could mean it could pose a serious problem not only to the Horn of Africa but the entire Africa as well. So I think that's one of the problems. We're not agreeing what Ethiopia should be. I think there's the big difference. There's a rift. There's a political ideology. We're completely different in terms of what Ethiopia should be. And the second, like Professor Zgel mentioned, there's an unfinished state formation. So Ethiopia, the state formation of Ethiopia has not been completed. So we are not even agreeing on that. So since the previous regime, the emperor, so the state formation is still in the process. At some point, about 27 years ago, the nations and nationalities of Ethiopia, they try to create a federation by a social contract, but Abiy Ahmed breached the social contract. I can mention multiple reasons. First, he dismantled the constitution, invited Eritrea, and invaded Tigray, and obviously Oromia and Somali. So I think that's the main problem. The federation is dismantled, the social contract is breached. So the unfinished state formation process was interrupted again. So this is the second problem. So that being said, I think Ethiopia's problem, I'm not sure. I don't think it will be resolved sometime soon. But if there's real talk, if there's good faith, I think there's a chance, for a peaceful resolution. Thank you very much.
The panelists have spoken in broader terms, looking at also the longer term situation for Ethiopia. I'm going to focus just on what I consider to be the most immediate problem facing the country. And that is, of course, the conflict in Eritrea, and rather the conflict in Tigray and its implications for the region. I think that the conflict there has reached a phase of remilitarization which makes it exceedingly dangerous, probably as dangerous as it has been over the last 2+ years. I think there's a situation where President Isaias of Eritrea is committed to defeating Tigray, ideally eliminating it as any potential threat to Eritrea. I think this is being joined by elements of the central government. And you have at the same time a feeling in Tigray that it is an existential threat to the region. So they're prepared to fight on for their very existence. This, I think, makes it an exceedingly difficult situation. And I worry that it may have reached the stage of not achieving a possibility of mediation or peaceful solution anytime soon. You have Professor William Zartman's idea of a mutually hurting stalemate for a lot of these conflicts around the world. And when you reach that stage, you can usually come up with some sort of mediation or peaceful solution. Unfortunately, I don't think that is the current stage in Tigray. I think the central government believes it now can win militarily, and I fear that that means this will continue as a military conflict for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
I think much has been said by previous speakers. Nice to meet you all, by the way, all panelists. Just 3 things. The first thing I think is mentioned by many of them, the nation building is at the core of the problem. But in that nation building, there is, I think, a crisis in accepting the reality on the ground. There is a reality that Ethiopia is a country of different nations, nationalities, but at the same time, there is entity who consider itself as a guarantor, as a protector of the state of Ethiopia or the nation of Ethiopia. I think there is a stark difference and antagonism on these issues. But I think the most important thing that should be raised at this time for Ethiopia to answer is there is an active genocide being committed by a state, by a government, by a country against its own people, inviting external actors as well. I think that's the most important question that Ethiopia and Ethiopians should answer at this time, because the people of Tigray are expecting for one. That's one. And combining these two, the problem, the failure of the nation building, plus a nation committing genocide against its own people, there's a bigger question now whether the country could be continued as it is or not. I think those are the things that we should be raised as a bigger